Welcome to the Healthy Christian Leader Show. Our vision is to see healthy leaders leading healthy churches that transform communities with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Together, we're on mission to be encouraged, focused, and equipped for harvest. Many times as Christian leaders, we spend all of our time pouring out and serving others. But the reality is we need to consistently take time to reflect on our inner life with God. We believe that the best and most effective ministry flows out of people who are leading from a sense of health and wholeness in their relationship with God, their relationship with themselves, and their relationship with others. In this show, we take time to delve into biblical principles, practical strategies, and inspiring stories that are going to help you in your journey of becoming a healthy Christian leader. So, with that being said, let's jump in and begin to think deeply about our own leadership and life with God as we grow on this journey together. Well, hey friends, welcome to another episode of the Healthy Christian Leader Show. My name is Spencer Conway, and I'm part of a team here at Ministries, and we are so excited about today's conversation. We have with us a very special guest who actually flew in to be with us today, which is awesome. This is Jonathan Zinck. And Jonathan, how are you doing today, man?
You know what? Doing fantastic. Really appreciate being here, Spencer.
Thank you so much for being here. We have a really awesome conversation planned today where we're actually going to be talking a little bit about some themes that Jonathan explores in a book that he wrote called When God is Silent. And I was really intrigued when I was just looking through your book, reading through your book, exploring some of the concepts that you talk about, because I really have this sense that, especially for pastors and Christian leaders who are listening right now, this is a topic that probably resonates, because a lot of people in ministry, they go through seasons where they sense God's silence.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have a couple questions that we want to talk through. Before we do that, though, Jonathan, would you mind just taking a moment to just tell a bit more about yourself, who you are, where you come from, just contextualize your story and your journey in church and your faith and ministry and what makes you you?
Yeah, what makes me me? That's a loaded question. But yeah, just a little bit about my background. I mean, I'm a generational maritimer.
Nice.
From this area. Grew up just outside of Halifax. Halifax was our home. And when I just really felt God directing me towards ministry, really didn't like church, right? Love God, didn't like church, just because of some experiences in church life. And so on my first ministry opportunity, actually, I worked with young offenders in Teen Challenge in downtown Toronto.
No way.
With Maury Blair, which was fantastic. And then from there, I just thought, this is going to be my jam, right? So my wife and I got married. We moved to Kelowna. And in Kelowna, that's where I started working with young offenders. And I was asked by a local church to come on. So my church ministry started in Kelowna, working with doing youth outreach and kids outreach. And from there, we moved back to Kingston. And from Kingston, we got involved at Queen's University and had an opportunity to come and pioneer campus ministry with Campus Crusade at the time. It's powered to change now. Here in the Maritimes, so we came and did that early 2000 with Athletes in Action Campus Ministry. And then after that, went to Brockville, Ontario, and pioneered a church called The Pier, which has just been such a blessing there. And then through that ministry, very outreach and missional oriented, was able to give leadership to humanitarian work in Southeast Asia. So I'd be many times during the year, I was in Africa, or I was in China, Nepal, India, Thailand, just really enjoying myself. And then out of the blue, I was approached by our local police service. And about 8 years ago, and they said, John, we really need mental health support for our officers. Would you come and do that role? So for the last 8 years, at first I was pastoring and doing it, and then full-time went into doing trauma and crisis counseling and support for police, first responders, and most recently, I'm also supporting hospital staff at our hospital. And I teach action in an addictions and mental health program at a local college there in Brockville. So that my ministry has just, as you can see, it's quite a journey that's touched in a lot of different areas of ministry.
Yeah, you've served in like a lot of different contexts, which
served in a lot of
super
different
cool.
contexts, yeah.
Okay, so the question that comes to mind then is this. You write a book called When God is Silent. And
Yeah.
even just over the last couple minutes as you're describing your journey, your background, you've been in a lot of different contexts, working with a lot of different people. What happened in your life that brought you to a place where you would even want to write a book exploring the topic of when God is silent?
Well, I mean, first, me writing a book, I've always told people I would love to be able to share my story, but I'm not a writer, so it'd be more of a scratch and sniff book, right? That's what the extent of my knowledge. But the reason behind it is, and it goes along with my story, one is my personal experience, but also the experiences that I've journeyed with others. So as I talked about this broad opportunity God's given me in ministry, what it did, though, is it also shaped my theology or my understanding of my relationship with God. I had it defined, put a bow on it, right? It was specific. So in my personal life, when leading into the book, when I first started writing it in 2015, I had an experience in my life where it wasn't just about the chaos, but as I mentioned in my book, where the one voice I needed to hear, because it was noisy in the chaos, God seemed intentionally silent. In that moment when you feel God is silent is a crazy, horrible place to be. And subsequent to that, the reason why we republished the book, experiences since then. So, but if it was just my experience, I wouldn't have wrote the book. I'd just deal with it. But journeying with other people and understanding what I was going through, other Christians and especially leaders that are afraid to have that conversation, because in Christianity we've learned you never question God. You don't challenge God and say, God, why are you silent? Why are you abandoning me? Which is crazy, because some of the most powerful passages in the Bible, we hear David say, God, why did you slay me? Where are you? I can't hear you. Why have you abandoned us? And so wanting to start a conversation saying, sometimes if we really want to have a full understanding of God, it doesn't just include the context of blessing and positive experience. It's having those honest conversations where God is bigger than us. We can challenge God, and we can say, God, you seem absent. And in this book, God, you are being intentionally silent, and I can't hear you. How dare you? So that's why I wrote the book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So in some of the conversations, you mentioned that it didn't just come out of your own story, but it came out of the stories of other people that you were hearing.
Yeah.
As you've talked to different people through the years and hearing about their experiences as they kind of go through their own season of so-called silence from God, what are kind of the context where people actually experience that? What are some of the causes that bring a person to a place where they begin to say, man, it feels like God is silent?
Well, I think similar to me, and actually, if one thing that anybody gets out of this interview is there's some great Christian writers like Richard Rohr, and he makes a comment that in humanity and life, there's the center and there's the circumference. And our world lives in their circumference. So that's our experiences, what we taste, touch, feel, everything's about it. And that the majority of Christian faith, and even in ministry, we minister in their circumference. We're dealing with people's pain and anguish and question. And our scorecard becomes that everything makes sense and everything goes well, right? And so the challenge when we're living in their circumference, like so many of us do in ministry, is when life goes sideways. When it doesn't go by the formula that A plus B equals C, and things happen that you weren't expecting, you not only start reeling from your experience, but your understanding of God is tied up in that.
Right.
God's voice is tied up in that. And so when your world falls apart, so does your relationship with God. And you feel abandoned and alone. And I think that's where it comes from for most people. And in my book, I match up with Elijah, not because I think, Elijah's great, we want to be great. But here is recognizably, in biblical history, one of the most significant spiritual leaders in the Bible, next to Moses probably. And finding themselves in a moment after their greatest victory, he had this big altar, and burning sacrifices when it was full of water, and all the just showed up all the priests of Baal. Immediately after, he's running for his life.
Right.
Scared, alone, but feeling like God was silent and God abandoned. And his word to God was, take me now. And I think that a lot of spiritual leaders find themselves in that place because, not selfishly, but unbeknowingly, their whole relationship with God and ministry is tied up in their circumference. And when their circumference crumbles around them, so does their understanding of God, and so God becomes very silent.
Wow, that's so good. I love the way that kind of you explore like the tension where like it's not just about the positive experiences in our relationship with God, but it's also the fact that there's sometimes like negative stuff that we go through. And it reminds me of like the beauty of the Bible, which I only first heard this kind of put to me like a number of years ago while I was going through seminary. I was learning about wisdom literature, specifically like the Psalms, the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. And this really interesting tension you find in the wisdom literature, which shows exactly the tension you're talking about. The book of Proverbs is kind of like this ABC book where it's like, hey, if you follow God's principles, then most of the time life's going to turn out pretty good for you. Yeah. And it's like Job then is kind of like the exception to the rule of Proverbs, where it's like, well, Job was the guy who was living the proverb life. Yeah. And then the rug gets taken out of his feet. And so it's actually beautiful when you go to the scriptures. You actually see this vast expanse of experiences that you can kind of map your own experiences onto. And it's a shame that so many times growing up in church, we kind of only have the framework for the Proverbs type experience, and we don't know what to do when we find ourselves in a Job-like season.
I agree. I was just talking with a friend who's going through a crisis, strong spiritual leader, and he's a doctor, and as we were talking, he said, the problem is, as humans, we see through this lens, and God for us is within that lens. Right. And we forget that God isn't, we have boundaries, God doesn't, and God's outside that lens. And so when things within my view get blurry or go sideways, so does God, right? And so that becomes our biggest challenge. And I agree with you. I think some of the most powerful moments of transformation in our life is when our circumference gets ripped apart. I mean, as you see in the Bible, Elijah's greatest spiritual moment was his darkest moment. Right. David, some of the greatest spiritual insights he gave, and Moses as well, when he's wandering with the people of Israel in the desert. And before then, actually when God called Moses, were those moments when their circumference was torn apart.
So with all that in mind then, would you say that this season is actually necessary for us in our discipleship and growth as followers of Christ?
That is a really good question. The word necessary. It's probably not necessary, but I think as in it has to happen. We always say, God does this. But I think the problem is, as human beings, in a way, it does need to happen for us. I live my life in learning like I play hockey. I go 100 miles an hour and the boards turn me around when I hit the boards, right? A lot of us in life, that's how when we're off course, sometimes we have to hit the wall to turn us around. C.S. Lewis talks a lot about in his book, The Problem with Pain. Yeah. And talks about the importance of pain for that reason. That it is, and I believe this, I told people even about the COVID crisis, whatever. I said, pain and tragedy and crisis causes us pain, but really what it does most is it illuminates and amplifies where we are at. Right. And sometimes it's these crisis moments that break down the blinders, and they illuminate and amplify to us, this is where I'm at. And if where I'm at, I feel that God isn't, then maybe the best thing for me was this moment, as painful as it is. And I hate pain. Simply because now it's going to give me a little bit of direction of where I need to be and where I need to pursue. And I start pursuing God's voice.
Wow. Yeah, you mentioned C.S. Lewis, and it reminds me of that quote. I think it probably is from The Problem of Pain. I'm not sure yet. You can correct me if I'm
I don't
wrong.
know.
But it's that quote where he says, pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
It is, yes.
Right?
It
like,
is,
wow, that's good.
Yeah.
Well, jumping a little bit more into your book, one of the things that struck me is that the title is called When God is Silent, but I was reading through towards the end of chapter 2, you make this statement where you say God is never silent. He is screaming from a voice that we seldom allow ourselves to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like I was following kind of the idea here. So could you explain a little bit more of that to me? It's like, when you say when God is silent, is it that you're describing, is it more of like a perception that we have as humans, but perhaps not an accurate representation of what's really happening, and that we just need to like reorient ourselves to, you were talking about the glasses, like what's outside? Like, talk to me a little bit more about that. Because at first when I read that line, God is never silent, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. The title of the book is When God is Silent.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because to us, God is silent. And it's just like physiologically, we can hone our ears to certain frequencies. And actually, when we get older, we lose some. And I realize that now when I'm listening to music. My kids are like, oh, can you hear that? And I'm like, no. And it's not that the sound isn't there,
right?
But I can't hear it because I'm not tuned into it. And I think a great, I'll use the Elijah example again in the book. God is always, one thing we have to be assured of, and the confidence in our darkest times, is that we have to understand God in the sense of God loved us not only before we existed, died for us before we existed, has done everything to pursue us before we even were born. So we understand that heart of God, and that God is always present. God talks about that. But that sense of, like, for example, with Elijah, felt abandoned. And in that moment, Elijah and everybody to that point, God expressed God's self in 3 ways: cloud, fire, earthquake. Right? And let's add winds to say 4. So God does something for Elijah, brings him up on the mountain, and goes into the wind, fire, and earthquake. And it was still silent to Elijah. And then when God speaks in a soft voice, I think the proper understanding of that passage is God just communicates in a way that Elijah never heard before. And the aha moment for Elijah was, there's more to God. God's voice isn't limited to these 3 things. And so it's my hearing, not allowing myself to understand that God is even bigger than that. And I think that's for us too. For my personal journey, was I had to get this desperate place of breaking down and saying, and I did this research once saying, what does it mean to wait on God? And waiting on God in the Bible is defined 4 different ways: celebrating God, surrender, trusting God, and thanking God. Wow. Those are the 4 contexts. What you don't see is it's a theological understanding of breaking down and defining who God is. It isn't. It isn't about naming God. I love that we say God's name is Yahweh. No, God was saying, I am who I am. David, when he had a revelation, when God was silent, said, God is my God. There was no defining of God. It was a recognition. That's the God I'm talking about. And it's finding us in that moment. And actually the cover is an illustration painted by my oldest son.
Wow.
And the reason why I wanted it for the book is so gripping is because on the cover, it's a vulnerable child who's searching in the dark looking for light. But they have a lantern. The light is actually leading them in the search to get out of the darkness. And maybe even unaware of what the light is actually doing. And so the long answer to your question is, not only is God always present, but even when God is silent, when we're trying to find God's voice, it's actually God's voice that's leading us to God's voice, if that makes sense.
Interesting. Yeah.
You know, we're unaware that actually that silent voice is leading us, and that God is always present, and God is the one who is trying desperately to get our attention.
It reminds me of the concept of the dark night of the soul from St. John of the Cross.
Yes,
I remember learning about that in Bible college, and that kind of being like a framework for understanding this experience that is so common to so many Christians. Yeah. So for pastors and leaders especially, the complexities of ministry in this day and age, the hurts that you may face in ministry, the expectations that you may feel, whether those are self-imposed or perhaps being imposed by, the context where you serve. There's so many varying factors that could lead a pastor or a Christian leader to come to a place where they're going through the dark night of the soul, or the season where they sense God is silent. If you were sitting down with a pastor just over coffee and they were explaining to you that this is where they found themselves, what kind of advice might you give them, or what would you want to share with pastors who find themselves in that type of season? Well,
the first thing I want to do is, and I want to say this plainly, especially with the work I do now, is recognize the legitimacy of the pain that they're in.
Yeah.
When you work with people, I can't use some of the vernacular I use with some of my first responders, but it's like being a farmer. Say a dairy farmer, I say. You're working in other people's mess all the time.
Yeah.
And it gets on you.
Yeah.
And people don't recognize that ministers in ministry, you carry that burden. You carry the criticism. And if you're not daily trying to get that off of you, it can affect every part of your life. So dairy farmers every day go into a mudroom, strip down their clothes, wash it, jump in a shower, because they don't want to bring it into the home.
Wow.
But in ministry, it's hard not to have that. So I equate pastors like I do with police officers, with other first responders, of what they experience and the trauma that they experience. So I want to recognize that. And the second piece I want to say is, and this is the hardest thing, surrender all those senses of control that you've created as safety. Because we create this sense of safety to help navigate all of the stress that we're under. To be able to let it go and surrender to God and be vulnerable and transparent. Say those words, I don't know. God, I need you. And I'm going to, that beautiful part of waiting, I'm going to surrender. And I'm also going to be honest and transparent with God.
Right.
And just express how you're feeling. Express to God, even if you're disappointed in God, even if you think God failed you, tell God. Because it's going to be in that vulnerability, that Elijah moment, where then we're open to allow God to reveal God's self in a way that we've never experienced before.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I remember probably the first season that I really started to go through this is when my oldest brother Garrett passed away. He died by suicide about 5 years ago. And I remember after a week or so of being in the hospital, we finally had to say goodbye. And I had this vivid, raw moment of just lament and pain. My wife was waiting in the hospital lobby, and I had to go get the car. I got into my car, and I just let it rip. I was just screaming out to God in pain and anger and sorrow. And if somebody would have drove by, they probably would have thought, "Oh man, this guy's having a psychotic break or something."
Right. Mental health apprehension right there. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But it's interesting that I look back on that, and as awful and as ugly as that moment was, I really do think that it was a necessary part of my process through that dark night of the soul that I was going through.
If we're not 100% transparent with God, how do we expect God to minister to 100% of us?
Yeah.
Right? And it's that moment. It's difficult though. It's a hard place to be.
Yeah, because you have to face the real emotions that come with it, and a lot of the sad and angry emotions, they're not comfortable to experience when you're in the midst of it. But for me, the thing that I think carried me through in wanting to face those things, despite how hard it was recognizing, like, what's the alternative? What's the alternative if I don't face this? What happens to me? Have you ever seen, like...
Oh, yeah. It happens all the time, because that's our choice. And then our choice is to take more control and grip harder and try to create life the way we do. And not only doesn't that work, because we're very limited, but what happens in the end is that we're missing out on who God is.
Right.
If I have to walk in denial in order to have a relationship with God, then my relationship with God isn't 100% true.
Wow.
Because part of it's denial. How can I have 100% know that God is the God that I serve? God walks in honesty and truth.
Wow.
And it is a painful journey. But we need that. We need that. The best thing you could do as a leader isn't your abilities or talents. It's the willingness to be vulnerable and transparent before God.
Wow, that's good.
Yeah.
So, everything that you talk about in your book kind of leads to this revelation of like the need for us to like hear God's voice.
Yes.
And to be open to maybe different ways of God speaking to us that we're not necessarily used to. Maybe we like had God in a certain box, but his speaking, goes far beyond the box that we had him in. How have you learned to discern and hear God's voice in your own relationship with the Lord over the years? And are there any kind of practicals that you would want to pass along to pastors as we kind of begin to just land the plane here?
So I'm a practical, hands-on learner, but I take this approach because I think it's the biblical approach that God gives us a direction to. When you look at it, God just says, I want you to be active, love God, love neighbor. We get too heady. Richard Rohr, again, has a great explanation, and he says, we live faith a lot, and we teach faith, that right thinking leads to right living. And he said, I've learned to understand that it's right living that leads to right thinking. And so it's the active application of what it means to love God. And it's a tough journey. God says that to Elijah. He doesn't change Elijah's situation. He reveals himself and says, okay, Elijah, I want you to go back to where you were. And I want you to relive these moments. And so for us as well, for me, it's been the focus on what does it mean to actively love God? Hard moments, walking in forgiveness. All of these practical things. If I'm going to love God, I need to love and forgive others. I need to walk in rightness of my character. It's not about my abilities, or my scorecard has to change. My scorecard isn't about what I've achieved. My scorecard is, am I living and exempling the love of Christ? My love towards others. Am I living in grace? Am I living in benevolence? Is my ministry a reflection of all the words that I say, or about the missional attitude that I live? And in my right living, that then not only do I learn who God is, because now I'm not learning about God, I'm actually walking with God.
Wow.
And in walking with God, then it changes my thinking of who I am. I guess in short, it's what Richard Rohr talks about, living in the center. Living my faith, I'm living in my center. My identity is in the center core of who I am. My circumference just becomes the fruit of my active living of what it means to love God and love neighbor. So I would encourage, and it's tough. It would be so easy just to say, let's emotionally get yourself in the right place. That's a lot easier than forgiving the people who have hurt you, forgiving yourself.
Right.
Walking in grace with others who don't walk in grace with you. So yeah.
It sounds like it's a long journey.
It is.
It takes a lot of time, a lot of consistency. I know for me, trying to incorporate the practice of silent prayer into my times has helped me learn how to discern the voice of the Lord. And that's something that I would challenge people to consider. Sometimes prayer is just all us talking. We never take time to just be in the silence, similar to that revelation Elijah has on the mountain. But hey, that is all that we have for today. So thank you so much for coming and sharing a little bit more about this. We will include more information about the book. If you would like to get your hands on a copy of Jonathan's book, you can check that out in our description, our show notes. But hey, thank you for joining. We're so excited for just the impact that this is going to have in your life. And we're just praying God's blessing on you if you are in the midst of a season where God seems silent. Blessings, and we can't wait for our next conversation. Hey friends, thanks for checking out our episode of the Healthy Christian Leader Show. We pray this episode has encouraged you on your own journey of growing as a healthy Christian leader. If this has blessed you in any way, we want to challenge you to consider giving financially to support the work that we are doing here at Aaron Ministries. Your giving enables us to continue creating resources just like this for Christian leaders, both locally and around the world. And so if that's something that you'd be interested in, you can head on over to aaronministries.com/give to partner with us today. And another way that you can partner with us is by sharing our digital resources with pastors and Christian leaders in your networks. So if this content or any other piece of content that we've created has blessed you, we would encourage you to send it to a friend and help us spread the word about what God is doing amongst Christian leaders today. Thanks for checking us out. We can't wait to see you next time.